Hello, Read 581, and welcome to week 6. We are really in the thick of things now, deep into the fall semester. This week we talk about strategies for word recognition and fluency. And before we get into that, just a couple of logistical items for you. So this week there are 3 readings. I do recommend that you take a look at all of them. The first is in Instructing Students, which is chapter 8 of that on word recognition and fluency. A lot of good information in here, especially if you're taking the COMPS exam. Lots of definitions and terms and examples of practical application strategies that can be used in the classroom. In the core teaching reading source book, I'd like you to look at chapter 7, which is on irregular word reading, sometimes synonymous with sight words, words that need to be memorized because students are unaware or unknowing of the sound spelling patterns in that particular word. And then lastly, also in the core teaching reading source book is chapter 10 on fluency instruction. There is a lot of overlap actually between chapter 10 and chapter 8. They complement each other pretty well. So I would recommend maybe reading chapter 8 in depth as it has more substance to it, and then kind of perusing chapter 10 of the teaching reading source book. They do provide some additional ideas and strategies, and they do a really nice job of breaking it down step by step into what exactly you need to do. So some great ideas in here that support what is going to be learned in chapter 8. Now, this part of the course, which I'll talk about in a minute, is more of your self-directed learning. And what I mean by that is that you may, say, I have a student who doesn't need word recognition and fluency, which is hard to believe because, as we know, the true definition of fluency includes many different facets. And so to say that they are completely proficient if they're a delayed reader in every area of fluency might be an oversight, maybe not. But that's why I decided to select this topic to work on first, is because typically most of the students we select for intervention need to develop some area of their fluency. And for that reason, I think you probably will want to do these readings, if not just for your own edification. But as we continue into our 10 weeks of intervention, you may, not necessarily need to do some of the readings if it's not an area of focus for your students. So let's take a look actually at what I'm calling phase 2 of the class. So, we just kind of did high speed assessing. That was phase 1 of the class, was assessment on steroids, basically. And now phase 2 of the class includes 10 weeks of intervention, so weeks 6 to 14. And then it's also going to be, your personal growth and study. So as I've mentioned, there are specific topics for each week, minus our comps weeks. There's no heavy duty reading then. And so it's kind of up to you to determine what readings and topics are relevant to you as a professional, as well as relevant to you with your work with your student. So there isn't going to be a ton of content coming from me because you guys are directing your own learning. And that's the purpose of the coaching cycle, is for you to first do the video reflection, which leads into us meeting and discussing your reflection and kind of your goals and, projected outcomes from this course in our pre-observation meeting. And then, looking at how you're applying what you're learning and researching independently through your self-directed study during the observation, and then the post-observation debrief, and then ultimately wrapping up with that second video reflection. So basically, the learning for the next 10 weeks isn't necessarily going to come through me, through lectures and content. I'm going to try to curtail those back a little bit, but instead it's going to come through our interactions in the coaching cycle. if that makes sense. So week 6 this week, we're talking about word recognition and fluency. We have a WIPR due. As you know, those are happening every 2 weeks. Next week 7, word identification and decoding. That's when your video reflection is due. If you haven't taken a look at those materials, definitely do that. You do need to video record yourself working with the student to complete that exercise. So you're likely going to want to do that this week. Week 8, there's no reading, but you have a WIPR due. Week 9, there's no reading as well. Again, these are the comps weeks. So if you're a project person, you get to benefit from those comps people being real stressed out these 2 weeks as well. Week 10, our focus is vocab. You have a WIPR due. Week 11, we start comprehension part 1, such a big topic that we're continuing at week 12 for comprehension part 2. WIPR due then. Week 13, we talk about severe needs. Video reflection number 2 is due. And if you feel that you have a student who falls into the severe needs category or the ELL and special needs category, you might want to jump into these chapters and assigned readings a lot sooner. And then week 14, we talk about ELLs and special needs. You also have a WIPR due. I have tentative. I'm probably going to make this optional since, it's going to be such a quick time due before the, final reports and things. I'd rather you spend your time and energy getting those final reports really polished, the parent caregiver letter, and then the final assessment intervention report. So I have tentative here. It could be one of those optional situations if you want to boost your percentage for the WIPRs and assessment charts. So this is a look at the next 10 weeks, phase 2 of the class. Again, all of this is happening simultaneously with this real hands-on, job-embedded learning, so to speak. What's due this week? You should be doing intervention session number 2 so that you can submit your weekly intervention plan and reflection for sessions 1 and 2. Also, work should start on your video reflection. Things to keep on your radar. Video reflection is due next week. Week 8, you have the WIPR for sessions 3 and 4. All right, so let's talk a little bit about strategies for word recognition and fluency. Again, because this is detailed so well in the readings, I'm not going to deliver a lot of information. At least I hope I can keep this on the shorter end. You never know with me, though. And so I'm going to encourage you to do the reading, and I might tend to highlight 1 or 2 things, although I do have a few slides. Again, a reminder, our course objectives we're looking at have shifted from assessment to really focusing on using research, so from all of our different classroom resources, as well as what you've learned in the program up until this point, to make strong decisions for curriculum, instruction, and intervention, and to ensure that you're being effective. So purposefully designing and delivering effective individualized instruction that accelerates student learning, demonstrate high-level skills as a reflective practitioner by engaging in rigorous cycles of reflection. Again, that's happening both with the WIPR, the reflection piece, and then your video reflection. So we are definitely working hard on these 3 objectives in case you had any doubt. I did want to start by just showing you some sample plans I've used in the past. This one I shared with you last week for a 6th grade student and my breakdown here. So I know we went over that before, but as a reminder, you have this to look at as a sample, as well as a sample WIPR from another student from a past semester. This is actually the early guided reading lesson plan, but the older version from the Next Steps in Guided Reading. So it looks a little different than the Next Step Forward. However, if it was me and, I had a student who, needed work in, fluency and comprehension, the guided reading intervention is amazing. I would follow the Next Step Forward to the letter and use that. So this is my plug yet again for the Next Step Forward. They start out with sight word review, where students are writing sight words they've learned. This is very quick, introducing the new book. Usually they're 2-day lesson plans in the Next Step Forward. Some of the higher levels, this is for levels D through I, so end of kinder to mid to late first grade levels. 2-day lessons, but some of the more advanced levels are 3 days. So on the first day, you're introducing the book, and then students are reading it independently, and you're prompting them, not giving them the word, not enabling or creating a dependency on you. Then you have a couple of teaching points that you give them after they do the reading. These could be predetermined based on needs or results from the week prior. These could also come up organically as well. And then a discussion prompt. And then also at the end, she has added word study as well as sight word learning. So again, I would follow Next Step Forward as it's written. Day 2, you do sight word review again. They reread the book from day 1. You're still doing the prompting and the teaching strategies, and then you can have a discussion prompt. And then there's also guided writing that happens after. So I actually think this got cut off a little bit when I did the insert screenshot, but there is more that happens after this. And these are really nicely structured 30-minute interventions that can be done in addition to some work on some other things. So I would definitely utilize that tool. This is an intervention lesson plan I used for kindergartners, guided reading level C. So this is actually only a 20-minute intervention because I just found that working with a small group of kindergartners during mid-year, this was what they could handle. So we always started out with fluency work or a familiar read. Remember, per our course text last week, we learned that it's recommended that they spend a third of their time reading connected text. So we start out right away. They're reading, a book that they've already worked on, which is a strategy provided for fluency, easy reading. So having them reread something familiar to them so they're not stumbling through the words, and they're, getting multiple exposure to some of those sight words and common words so they can transfer them then to their sight word knowledge. And this is a good time to do some progress monitoring to take a running record on one of the students. So here they read The Pet Store, which was a reminder to me had the word here in it. And so I was really looking at had they mastered that sight word in context. And then we move into phonemic awareness and sight word work. And so working on segmenting, I had some words for them to segment. We also had sight word bags that we were cumulatively adding to. As they recommend in, I want to say, chapter 7 of the Teaching Reading Sourcebook, to start out just teaching one sight word at a time, especially for these younger students. So I added and we. I think and being a CVC, I'm sorry, not a CVC, but a decodable word, kind of balanced the we being more irregular to them at this time. And then also what I like to do is when I would listen to the students read individually, listen in on them the way I would do it is I would give out the books at different times so that, they wouldn't be chorally reading, because you want them to be independently reading and applying strategies. So, I'd have the student to my immediate right start reading, and then maybe the student directly in front of me start reading, and then the student. And so they're all starting from the beginning, but at different times. So they can't just listen and follow the person next to them. But as I was listening to them, if there was a sight word that would come up that they had difficulty with, I would write it on a note card and add that to that group's sight word bag so that we could add that to our review each week. Another thing you can do is get popsicle sticks and color it with a Sharpie, green on one side, red with another. And these younger students can use that as a pointer stick for one-to-one matching, which you want to wean back. Wean them from the, pointing one-to-one, and instead do a swipe, fluid motion once they get to level C, level D. And she talks about this in the Next Step Forward. Jan Richardson does that. We want them to be reading fluidly and not one word at a time, but it is really important for these emergent early readers to be doing one-to-one matching, so they're not skipping words or trying to memorize a pattern and just spitting that out, but actually making sure what they are saying does match the word in the print. So again, popsicle sticks, red on one side, green on the other. They have it on green. If they come to a word they are unsure of or they need some support with, they can turn it to red so you can visually see, ooh, who needs some prompting from me? So that way you can reinforce accurate reading and you can monitor, how the students are doing. If you're listening to someone and someone gets stuck, they have a way to show you that they need some help. So that's a good strategy when you're working with, more than one student, which is not the case in this class. So then the last chunk of time was spent on phonics/reading. So here we are reviewing all letter sounds. They had some B and D confusion we were working on. We preview the book. We do a picture walk. They start to read it. Same thing here. This day we switched to a new book, picture walk, activate. Oh, here we're looking at P and Q confusion. And then the, rereading of the familiar book. So, this was my kind of outline of the lesson because at this point, I was so familiar with what I was doing, I didn't need it entirely scripted. This is similar formatting for a guided reading level F, starting with that familiar read for 5 minutes, moving into our phonics work. So here we're doing short E and I, short vowel sounds, medial sounds, introducing the book on this day, so rereading. So this is really similar to that guided reading lesson plan that I showed you. I just happened to put my phonics word work piece at the beginning where she had it at the end. I don't know, I'm sure she has a good reason for putting it at the end, and had I had the Next Step Forward sooner in my career, I probably would have followed that instead of creating my own system. This is level G. Just wanted to show you that my phonics focus changed to AR, are controlled here, but similar formatting. And then this is a level O. And what I liked about this is I was really clear about having objectives at the top. So these are the objectives for the week. Basically decoding multisyllabic words, using context clues to predict meanings for unknown words, so vocabulary building, and then answering literal, inference, and critical questions. That's kind of a lot to work on in 1 week. Most of these post-reading extensions are literal questions, so I think it might have been better to just focus on literal questions. But you can see again, they're doing rereading from a familiar text. We're doing some pre-reading work, so predicting sight words. Here we're doing word work, which is multisyllabic words and vocabulary building. We have a guiding question. Here's what we're doing during reading. I was really focusing on having them chunk words into meaningful parts that they know and think about the meaning. So, cross-checking, does it make sense? Does that look right? And monitoring what they are reading so that they can, and actually, as I listened into them, as they read a page, I'd have them covered up and tell me in their own words what they had just read about. So that's a reading recovery strategy. And then they had a post-reading extension. So this, I believe, 6-11, about 25, 30 minutes. So another kind of guided reading focused intervention taking 30 minutes. All right, let's talk about Some of the reading from this week. So word recognition and fluency is our focus. It's important to know that these things are all kind of interrelated puzzle pieces that fit together. There is a difference between word recognition. Word recognition implies that it is an instant recall of words in which the reader isn't utilizing any strategies. They can automatically, recall or read the word. Whereas word identification goes more with decoding and phonics. They're having to utilize at least one strategy, if not more, to figure out the word. But the more automatically they're able to do this, then that, kind of lends itself into word recognition, which then helps your fluency and automaticity. The quicker you can identify and recall words, the more fluent you are going to sound, the more automaticity you have. And another key component is the reading of irregular words and your sight word knowledge. The more, sight words you have in your bank, the faster you can recognize them and recall them, and the quicker you can read. So in Chapter 8 of Instructing Students, we learn about the importance of recognizing words on sight. We know that sight word recognition is a prerequisite that aids in word identification strategies. We know it promotes more instantaneous word recognition. We know that basically automatic recognition of words is the basis of fluency, and it also contributes to improved comprehension. And this was an interesting point too, that Adams talks about those who struggle with word recognition. It's the single most pervasive and debilitating cause of reading disability. And that's why we're kind of starting there, because I imagine in some way your student has a need in this area. But basically, as I'm sure you know by this point in your coursework, we as proficient readers have a very extensive sight word knowledge because we've had so many exposures with so many different words that they're now, been transferred to our sight word knowledge, and we don't need to utilize any strategies to identify the word, but we can recognize it now with automaticity. So we want to help our students build their sight word knowledge. This chapter also goes through those phases of word learning, which I am not going to do. You can read through them, but this is a great review of those, with the important point being that it is critically important to meet students at their present stage of development. So, if they only know some letter sound correspondences, it's not really very appropriate to be giving them long vowels. So really utilizing your assessment results to plan instruction that makes sense for them developmentally. They also give some awesome student case studies that say, here's Bridget, she's in the pre-alphabetic phase of word learning. How do I know that? Here's my synopsis of the assessment information. Here are the instructional strategies I selected for her, and they're very detailed, so you could definitely draw from these to come up with your own intervention plans. And then they explain the outcomes of instruction. So after 30 hours of intervention, here's how she's performing now. And they go through that with another student, Deanne, as well. They give you lots of word practice activity ideas and specific teaching ideas. This was a nice section. What page was that on? On the bottom of page 299, they talk about word recognition and oral reading. And they give you 8 different prompts, teacher prompts that can be used in order to help support students to solve the words on their own, because we do not want to be telling the student a word that maybe if you were doing a fluency practice drill, but overall, telling students words has little long-term value. You want to give them the tools to solve the words on their own. And then same thing goes for if you're doing group reading instruction. Sometimes I've seen it where, someone in the group is allowed to call out the word. And that's the same thing. You're creating a dependency on others to read instead of giving them the tools to be independent. So great prompts. And then they wrap up with a discussion on fluency. They remind us of the definition, which isn't very concise, but they have that fluency is reading accurately. So accuracy, words correct per minute, quickly, so rate being important, and easily, so it sounds fluid like you're talking. Automaticity is there. They're able to organize text into appropriate syntactical units, so phrasing, as indicated by the appropriate use of prosodic features, so expression, intonation, volume, pitch, stress, etc., and then support processing, meaning, so comprehension, efficiently and accurately. They also remind us that all of these elements that are part of fluency are intertwined. So if you are working on accuracy, that's also going to help your rate and your automaticity. If you are working on, chunking into meaningful phrases or phrasing, that's going to help the prosody and probably your accuracy because you're better understanding what you're reading. So those are intertwined. They take you through the 4 stages of fluency, which you can read about on page 301. And then they give you the key components of fluency instruction. And these are important to keep in mind as you are developing your interventions for fluency. First, you need to be clear and explicit about how the student's behavior should change. So, you're reading at a good rate, or you're reading quickly, which is good, but you're making a lot of errors. And when, you are reading a word that's not actually there or misreading a word, that's going to hinder your understanding of what you're reading. So you need to be very clear about, here is our goal. This is what we are focusing on. The intervention should be delivered with the appropriate level of materials. So, instructional level is good, but it should be a high instructional level. They should not be struggling to recognize and decode the words because then they're not going to be able to read that with appropriate fluency. So be very intentional about the materials you select and the level of those. Also pick interesting and engaging topics to your student. You should be providing multiple opportunities for practice, repeated readings, and then providing ongoing feedback on how the student is improving and needs to improve over time. So after your fluency work, talking about what they did well, what they need to focus on, you could graph their words correct per minute if you wanted, or give them feedback on their accuracy. So here are a ton of fluency strategies that they talk about both in Chapter 8 of Instructing Students as well as Chapter 10 of your core reading source book. I'm not going to go over all of these because you can read about them, but they are all geared towards these key components of fluency instruction. The one I wanted to highlight, which is not in your book, and I think I told you about it last week because I use it a lot with students, is precision reading. And that is when the student reads, you record their accuracy and then provide them feedback. So that's going to provide that ongoing feedback as well as give you a clear and explicit focus. You're going to use, a passage at their instructional level. And then I like to do it 3 times in one sitting. So that's going to give them multiple opportunities for practice. So you have your passage. I know that the core reading source book provides passages at different levels that have the running total of words in the margin on the right, which is very helpful when you're quickly trying to let your student know how many words correct per minute they got. So you can use those, or you can use the DIBELS oral reading fluency passages, which are leveled by grade. So again, go to their high instructional level, if not their independent level, to get started. And they have a copy in front of them without the number of words in the margin, and then you have your copy in a sheet protector. I like to do it so I can mark it up and then erase it after, or actually not erase it until the end of the session. But you set your timer for 1 minute. As soon as they start reading, you start it, you follow along, you put a slash where they stop, and you can use running record notation to indicate, any substitutions or insertions. And so then after they read for a minute, you give them that feedback, starting with the positive. Oh, you were able to read X, words per minute. You even got this very complex multisyllabic word. Hey, how did you figure that out? What strategies did you use? Okay, well, let me give you some feedback about something to work on. I noticed when you read the word riding, you dropped the ing, and when you read the word whatever, you dropped the ing. So we want to be really looking all the way to the end of the word and looking for those ing and those suffixes and making sure we are not dropping those suffixes. So I'm going to have you read it again for another minute, and I want to see if you can beat, whatever words per minute you just read and get those endings. Ready, go. They do it a second time, you give them the feedback. You do it a third time, you give them the feedback. Now, you can send that passage home for them to practice and then come back the next week and show you how well they did. Hopefully that'll be, a little bit of a motivator to beat their score, their time, and some authentic practice there for a repeated reading. Or you don't have to send it home, but I would recommend giving them that to practice. And then, next week, see how they do. And if they're at 80 to 85 words per minute, maybe you can retire that passage. But, the more times they read that passage, the better. Unless they're kind of getting bored of that passage, you can be the judge of that. All right, lastly, chapter 7 talks about irregular word learning. Irregular words being those that have one or more sound spelling correspondences that the student does not know. So there are words that are permanently irregular, like school, maybe, or was. And then because, they aren't phonetically at all possible. But then there are some that are temporarily irregular. So, maybe to the kindergartner, day is temporarily irregular because in first grade they learned that AY makes the long A sound. So then I actually know the sound spelling pattern there. So that's the difference between those. They give you a high frequency word list provided on page 244, and they remind you that the words you are selecting for your high frequency word practice are coming from your stories, passages, and those connected texts that they are reading. So irregular words shouldn't be introduced until students can read regular CVC words. So if they don't have any understanding of sound symbol correspondences or their, letter sounds, if they don't know letter sounds and they can't read CVC words, then when you show them a sight word, they have nothing to use to access that word. They don't know any of the sounds. Typically, students can identify the initial sound and then kind of look at the rest of the word and memorize it that way. But if they don't know any letter sounds, they have nothing to use to access that word. So you don't want to start, it's not developmentally appropriate to start sight words in the pre-alphabetic logographic stage. If this is a focus for your student, make sure you progress monitor it. So you probably gave some sort of initial assessment on sight words, and then you need to be diligent in keeping track of the sight words you're introducing, teaching. I would definitely send home those sight words for them to practice in between sessions. And then, next session, start with the sight word review. Can they read it? Can they spell it? And, continue to progress monitor it maybe every couple weeks. do a quick little, sight word knowledge inventory to see if they have retained the sight words you have taught so far before you give them a new, sight word assessment at the end. Word banks and word walls, they talk about being a great strategy, although the best way for regular word learning is through repeated exposures. Page 252 gives you the sound out strategy, 255 gives you the spell out strategy. So this was a little longer than I was hoping to be. Next week I will curtail it down when we talk about word recognition. Word identification. We know the difference between those. Now we do, hopefully, or after reading, you should know about it more. And decoding, so more of the phonics application skills, which may not be a focus for you, and instead you may want to read about comprehension or vocabulary or whatever it is your student might need. This is the choose your own adventure part of the course where you are independently researching and learning strategies geared toward your student needs so you can develop the best individualized instruction and get lots of great results in 10 weeks from now. So have a great week, everyone. Keep up that awesome work with your student. I look forward to reading those whippers and seeing what you are up to.